Hello, Robs. We're back with Mars Without Venus, study of some homosexual generals by Major General Frank M. Richardson. We pick back up at page 84, the chapter about Napoleon. A series of mistresses failed to satisfy Napoleon's need for affection, and something more than affection, the reassurance, which he said Josephine had given him, apart from her social connections with both the old and the new regimes. It is hard to imagine what reassurance she could have given to her self-confident husband, except in bed, for which she was well qualified. It was General Hoche who first called her a prostitute. He had had an affair with her in prison after her first husband was guillotined, but he drew the line at marrying her. After her release from prison, she had a serious affair with Barras, probably in the hope of finding a protector in the jungle of revolutionary Paris. She is said to have gone to bed with Hoche's Alsatian groom Van Acker, with an unnamed aide-de-camp, and according to the diarist Count Horace de Vielcastel, with his father, who was her chamberlain before marriage. When Napoleon married her, he named her Josephine, as if to make a clean start. She was christened, there we go, Marie Joseph Rose de Tascher de la Pagere, and had always been known as Rose or Yayette, her family pet name. If she brought reassurance to this seeker after ready-made love, she also brought disillusionment and later hatred, but she returned so heartily that she openly rejoiced at a false report of his death in Egypt. When he did return, sorry for the exorcist voice, when he did return, there were stormy scenes, locked doors, a tearful reconciliation, but no son and heir. Napoleon was soon planning for a ready-made son, but Cauvezard, the family physician, refused to be party to a fake present. I can't read. Probably shouldn't have drank a 10% beer. But Cauvezard, the family physician, refused to be party to a faked pregnancy for Josephine. Napoleon's reluctance to part from his reassuring partner seems to have been unfeigned, and long after her death he spoke of her as the one lasting love of his life. In St. Helena, he said, "I have never truly loved, except Josephine, a little." Well, that's not a fucking endorsement. Her coarse comments on his performance in bed and his own admission about his feebleness in the game of love may point to what he meant by a little, when assessing Napoleon's place in the Kinsey 7-point scale. I recorded a swing to the left, the heterosexual end. On account of the ardor of his wooing of his second wife, no hint of impotence there. As Marie-Louise entered her new realm, her bridegroom rode ahead of the welcoming party. Through torrential rain and dripping wet, jumped into her coach. Delighted with the impression which he had made, he bypassed Soissons, where they were to have spent the night, drove on to Campania, and settled down to supper for 3, himself, his bride, and his sister Caroline, who had been sent to Austria to fetch the young Archduchess, assured by his complacent step-uncle, Cardinal Fesch, that his proxy marriage was valid, and by Marie-Louise that her father had told her that she now belonged to her husband and must do everything he wanted. He bustled her into bed, More a rape than a wooing, said Lord Liverpool, the British First Minister, and indeed, this second marriage had been entered into in the spirit of a farmer buying a breeding heifer. That's the kind of womb I want to marry, said the Emperor, after studying Marie Louise's pedigree and noting how many of her relatives had had large families. About 11 months after the marriage, the waiting Parisians learned from the 101st gun that the Emperor had a son. Perhaps now some peace and stability could be expected. The birth of the King of Rome had been a truly terrible experience for both his parents. Napoleon had had to make the agonizing decision, save the mother, it is her right. He already knew that the child, a breech presentation, was the son for whom he had prayed. For the 19-year-old mother, convinced that she was to be sacrificed for the sake of the French nation's need for an heir to the throne, the approach of the accoucheur with his forceps had seemed like that of an assassin. The prolonged ordeal would have been enough to unhinge a more stable mind than that of the young empress. No Victorian young lady could have led a more sheltered life than Marie Louise's before her marriage. I thought she was a prostitute. Contact with males had been so restricted that even her pets and her dolls had to be female. Am I reading this wrong, or did he say she was a prostitute before she married him? Not. From the drab chrysalis of the repressed daughter of an uxorious father, with a stepmother who disliked her, she had burst into a new existence at the center of life to the most powerful ruler in Europe, who spared nothing to make her happy and even felt a curious reverence for her blue blood. Her few possessions had all been on the scale of her jewelry, some coral necklaces and green beads. Now beautiful jewels and an elaborate trousseau were chosen for her by a husband who had learned about such things from the wildly Oh, maybe. I guess this is a different person. I must have blacked out there for a minute. I thought her name was Marie Louise. No, it was Rose. Yeah. I'm thinking of Marie Joseph. Joseph. So what happened? About 11 months after the marriage. I guess I missed the part where they got divorced. Whatever. She reveled in all this and seemed to dote upon the generous provider, although she was later to say that she had never cared for him. The shallowness of her character was well illustrated when she was told of the emperor's downfall in 1814, which was the end of her life with him, for she never saw him again. Noting the downcast eyes of the courtiers, she said, "You are looking at my foot. Don't you think it's a pretty one?" She refused to join Napoleon in Elba or in Paris after his blazing return in 1815, because she was deeply in love with Count Neipperg, by whom she had two illegitimate children during her husband's lifetime. Like Mr. Munt, Napoleon possessed to a remarkable degree the power of distorting the past, and he spoke of Marie Louise as a loyal wife, kept from his side by cruel enemies. But the mask was off when he was writing his will, and was heard to cry out in anguish to be a Corsican and to forgive such an insult. As for Marie Louise, if only half the stories of her conduct after Neipperg's death are true, the term nymphomaniac is fully justified. Andre Castellot wrote that two men were kept fully occupied in attending to their sovereign's wants, and Baron Marshal, her chamberlain, stated that a sentry had to be stationed at her door to keep away her over-numerous lovers. They only gave up mounting the sentry when he was found to have mounted the ex-empress. Touche to that, buddy. Because of her betrayal and desertion of her husband, and ultimately of her son, Marie Louise was execrated, and for all I know, still is by Bonapartists. She should be pitied rather than blamed if, as I firmly believe, it was the terrible suffering, mental and physical, during her protracted and difficult labor which caused the remarkable deterioration in the character of this carefully nurtured girl. In such cases, especially if serious exhaustion has followed delivery, personality changes, even including insanity, often occur. Much of the story of Marie Louise's life after the birth of her son coincided with the course of such puerperal psychosis. Under these conditions, positive dislike and rejection of the child and of the husband, sometimes leading to divorce, may result. Marie Louise showed less and less affection for Napoleon, and he complained that she seemed to dislike kissing him. She did not kiss her baby and disliked being kissed by him. In the end, she virtually deserted the boy, then known as the Duke de Reichstadt, refusing to visit him when he was ill and wanted her. When she did visit him, he was on his deathbed, speechless from tuberculosis of the larynx. No wonder the poor young man concluded, she was not the wife my father deserved. I mean, she kissed everybody except her baby and her husband. If Napoleon had no luck with either of his two wives, he probably got all he deserved. He was usually far from being the romantic French lover of popular imagination, wooing women in the caressing tones of Charles Boyer. He was, in fact, a misogynist bore whose almost unbelievable public rudeness to women is well documented. A contempt for mankind was an unpleasant feature of his character, and women were not spared. His attitude to women was characteristic of men of weak sexuality, but it may have gone deeper than that. Arabs are said to have populated the Bonaparte's area of Corsica even before the Saracens. B. Fortescue in Napoleon's Heritage, 1934, traced the possible Oriental strain, which Napoleon himself perhaps recognized, for he called Corsica a little isle, half African. He had a deep feeling for Islam and once said, I was a Mohammedan in Egypt. I shall be a Catholic in France. Mere political expediency, no doubt, but an Islamic attitude to women was reflected in such pronouncements as women's duties are submission and dependence. He said that women in France received too much attention and should not be treated as men's equals, but as slaves, mere machines to make children, and all this did not endear him to women, many of whom wrote bitterly about him. The attractive Claire de Remusat was temperate and understanding. The emperor despises women, she wrote. He cannot learn to love them. So even Josephine's reassurance could not quite adjust this strange man who came into his own only in the world of men. R.F. Delderfield ended a brilliant passage summarizing Napoleon's record in the field with the question, why was it that Napoleon could inspire men to die blessing him without being capable of inspiring more than a tepid, self-seeking affection in the hearts of women? Mr. Delderfield wrote one of the 6 books about Napoleon's sexual life as a whole. Of the other 5, 3 were written by Frenchmen. Masson, Breton, and Savant. One by a German, Gertrude Aretz, and one by a Scotsman, myself. Only 2 of these books can be called salacious or vulgar, those of Breton and Savant. I hope I am not unduly prejudiced in excluding my own from that category. Breton harps with relentless and rather distasteful persistence on Napoleon's buttocks fetishism. That Napoleon should be a bottom man did not surprise me, since he was not only a Latin lover, but in my opinion, fairly strongly homosexual. Breton, however, surely overdoes it. When, writing of the emperor's preoccupation with shapely rumps, which set his palms tingling, he describes his disappointment that Queen Maria Louisa of Spain did not possess the provoking bust and enticing rump which his imagination had pictured. This is, in fact, one of those mused Napoleon kind of books which purport to know his secret thoughts, all rather French, if the comment may be allowed. An extensive bibliography is a reminder of the fact that many of the countless books about Napoleon have concentrated on his love affairs, always eager to act up to his chosen role as an aristocrat. We nobles, it almost seems that he felt that a mistress was an essential adjunct to the part he was playing. This chapter would grow far too long if I were to rehash my reasons for believing that Caulaincourt probably made an accurate assessment when he wrote, "It is a mistake to think that he had many mistresses. He lost his head sometimes, it is true, but it was rarely that he felt any need of love, or indeed any pleasure in it. The emperor was so eager to recount his amorous successes that one might almost have imagined that he only engaged in them for the sake of talking about them." Two of Napoleon's mistresses demand a closer look. The first of these is Mlle Georges, with whom he had a much publicized romance whilst he was first consul. The second, Marie Waluska, was to most people, I think, the nicest woman in his life. George was the nickname of a leading actress, even though it says actress, Marguerite Josephine Weimar. The boyish nickname, which she adopted as her stage name, was given to her by a homosexual actress, Mlle Roquefort, who habitually dressed as a man, and was called Papa by the child of an actress, Madame Ponty, with whom she lived. A contemporary cartoon depicted George indulging in homosexual practices with Mlle, I don't know what the hell that word is, MLLE, I could look it up, Roquefort. George had somewhat statuesque, there's Napoleon, a young Napoleon, and there's Elvis Napoleon. Let's see, go back there and read that last part there. George had somewhat statuesque beauty but lacked feminine charm. One actor found it repellent to have to act with her. She may have suffered from some defect of the pituitary gland, for she grew enormously fat, earning a second nickname, the Wow. As a prima donna, she liked to have an official of the theater walking before her, striking the floor with a white wand. Unkind critics said that he was testing the floorboards. She had a warm heart, and in her relations with Napoleon, a kittenish charm. Sharing his own rather surprising love of children's games, childish games, like children, they frolicked together, dressing up, playing at charades and hide and seek. With George, the first consul found much needed relaxation of an undemanding nature, but Josephine's worry over the affair was justified. For the first time, her husband insisted on separate bedrooms. He and George were certainly fond of one another. A great deal has been written about this notorious affair, which illustrated, as in their various ways did other affairs, a curious emotional immaturity in Napoleon's sexual relationships, a quality to which Mr. Delderfield applied the term sterility. Apart from his mother and his adoring younger sister, Pauline, Napoleon received true unselfish affection from only one woman in his life, the charming Marie Waluska. After his first abdication in 1814, he never again saw his second wife or his son. Marie Louise did not visit him in Elba or in Paris after his intoxicatingly triumphant return, but Marie Waluska, with her 4-year-old son, went to Elba and was clandestinely bustled off the island on a wild sea in a night of rising storm, lest her visit should give the faithless empress a further pretext for refusing to join him. Maria Waluska came to console him during the dark days after his abdication, to which Marie Louise was so indifferent, and she came again during the 100 Days, and was even ready to go to St. Helena. Yet he was so self-centered that he felt slighted when she married Count Dornano. As a young girl, Marie was a fervently nationalistic Pole, and she idolized the great conqueror who had promised to restore the sovereignty of her beloved country. Hero worship drew her as a recently married girl of 18 to welcome the emperor on his first entry into Poland. Napoleon was captivated, and before long, poor young Marie was under intolerable pressure from Prince Poniatowski and other leading Poles to sacrifice herself for the sake of her country. To the end, she tried to hold out, telling Napoleon that she had given to her baby son the flowers which he had sent to her, and hoping that affectionate regard for a man more than 20 years older than herself would be all that would really be demanded of her as the price of the independence of Poland, which her Machiavellian suitor never intended to grant. It was hardly surprising that an impressionable young girl should feel overawed, alone in the presence of the man who had dominated Europe since her early childhood and had been hailed as the Messiah of a new order in Europe by such men as Hegel and Goethe, and even Beethoven, until he learned that the people's hero had made himself an emperor. Anyway, the story of the legend has it that she fainted and Napoleon took advantage of this. Another rape, in fact. Marie Waluska became the heroine of romantic stories, plays, and films, and indeed it is a fairy tale which could hardly fail to enthrall Bonapartists, including generations of English admirers of their country's great enemy. She is much the nicest girl in the sordid saga, and perhaps her own character has little bearing on our study of Napoleon's sexual proclivities. However, it is only fair to those scheming Polish patriots to say that when they had to find an Iphigenia for their sacrificial altar of Venus this time, rather than of Diana, their choice may not have been so cynically cruel as it sounds. Other Polish women are said to have declared that they would gladly take her place. As for Marie, when she was 16, she had chosen to marry a senile old Polish nobleman rather than a much younger Russian. Count Waluska was well over 70, and his youngest grandson was nearly 10 years older than Marie herself. The alacrity with which she produced the son raised a few eyebrows, and her rather bitchy friend, Countess Potocka, who described her as lovely and dull, and said that her husband was an octogenarian, wrote that it gave room to all sorts of surmises, and if Napoleon was her last lover, it was asserted that he had not been the first. Napoleon was surely one of the most confident and aggressive characters in history, hardly a man in whom one would expect to find feelings of inferiority. However, Adler and other authorities have asserted that few of us escape these feelings entirely. Karen Horney called them perhaps the most common evil of our times. In my book, Napoleon, Bisexual Emperor, I defined many sources of such feelings, compensation for which could have conspired to make him the man he was. The least important of these was the one usually mentioned, his height. The most important, to which I will refer later, was what Adler called organ inferiority. Napoleon's family circumstances were typical of what Freud and leading authorities since his day have believed to be the most potent in producing homosexual sons. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a weak, ineffectual man, charming, easygoing, and content to leave the upbringing and discipline of his children entirely to their mother, the formidable matriarch Letizia Bonaparte. Her ideas on these duties, as we learn from Napoleon himself, might have seemed a little old fashioned even in those days, whilst as for today, well, judge for yourself. Here in Napoleon's own words is what happened when his grandmother complained that he and Pauline had mocked her rheumatic gait. My mother, though she loved us greatly, would stand no nonsense, and I saw in her eyes that I was in a bad case. Pauline soon received her fate, a petticoat being easier to raise than trousers to unbutton. That evening my mother tried to get hold of me, but without success, and I began to think that I had escaped altogether. Next morning she pushed me away when I approached to kiss her. However, I thought no more of it when later in the day she said to me, Napoleon, thou art invited to dine with the governor. Go and dress. I went upstairs, very pleased to dine with the officers, but my mother was playing with me as a cat with a mouse. She entered my room suddenly and shut the door. I then saw the trap into which I had fallen, but it was too late, and I had to submit to a spanking. J'ai dû subir le facile. Facile? This occurred when Napoleon was an artillery lieutenant, nearly 18 years old, and his submission at that age to such treatment suggests that it was not his first experience of it. If one accepts the views of many psychologists about the influence of corporal punishment of this sort, what's he supposed to do? Beat his mother? It is no surprise to learn that Napoleon exhibited a wide range of sadistic tendencies, including a delight in cruel sarcasm, outraging people's finer feelings, and coarsely insulting women in public in ways which were unpardonable in any man, let alone an emperor who could seldom be answered back. The few occasions when he was answered were memorable. One which hit him where it really hurt was when he had commented on the Duchess's pockmarked face. A Frenchman could never have told me so. And I'm going to stop there just because this is a long chapter and it's going to have to be broken up in 4 parts, and we're close to 28 minutes. All right, props. That's all for now. Goodbye.